Well, originally scheduled to stay just on Thursday, Emmanuel Macron ultimately decided to stay overnight on the devastated island of Mayotte, precisely to convince residents that he had heard their anger. Well, those extra few hours there arguably made the situation even worse. First, the president was recorded using really rather disparaging language towards residents, insisting that they would have been worse off if they weren't a part of France. And then just hours later, the French president was heckled again by locals who complained that they still have not received food and water deliveries, and this nearly a week after the storm. Take a listen.
Don't start dividing people. If you turn people against each other, we're screwed, because you're happy to be part of France. Because if you weren't part of France, you'd be 10 times more screwed.
Well, in the face of a perceived absence of the French government, residents of Mayotte are taking relief efforts into their own hands with a wave of grassroots solidarity. Florent Marché reports.
At this restaurant, there are no menus, plates, or bills. There are charging stations, powered by 2 generators. Dozens of people are here recharging their phones and laptops. After Cyclone Chido struck the French island of Mayotte, electricity has become a precious resource.
Many people need help. There's no water, no electricity. I met people who are getting hungry. It's getting very critical. It's a good thing we have this place to keep the outside world informed. But if it wasn't for this place, I don't know what we would have done.
In order to help as many locals as possible, the restaurant is offering its resources. The generators at Coco Beach run on gas originally intended for tourist boat tours. All unnecessary energy consumption has been cut. To avoid waste, only freezers remain plugged in.
It's all about solidarity. Everything is free. It's a place where people come together. People look for comfort. They can drink, eat, work, and children can play on the other side.
The restaurant's address is passed on by word of mouth. More arrive by the day. While waiting for government-promised aid, these initiatives are the only way to keep up local morale.
Well, for many observers, the anger across Mayotte is simply the logical conclusion to years of a widespread sense of neglect. For more, we're going to cross now to Nathalie Mrgudovic. And thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by asking you rather bluntly, has Mayotte been abandoned by the central French government?
I think we could say that it has been abandoned many years ago already. So, yes, I would say that since Mayotte became a département d'outre-mer, an overseas department in 2011, the hope that was raised or that were raised for the Maoris to immediately get the same kind of standard of living as La Réunion Island, the other French overseas department in the Indian Ocean, obviously that couldn't be done. And this feeling of being forgotten or neglected has always been there since. And for example, just this summer, the terrible drought that took place in and touched Mayotte, the response to that was quite slow and not sufficient. And the feeling of, being forgotten was already there. Plus, obviously, the attempt to fight against the illegal immigration, especially with the change of law or the wish to change of law. For example, when it comes to who can actually get the French citizenship, being born on a French land is not enough. I mean, it won't entitle you automatically to the French citizenship. And so the law has been slightly amended in Mayotte, so a requirement of 3 months before the birth of a baby in Mayotte. One of the parents has to have legal documents that allow them to stay, to be in Mayotte legally. Elsewhere, it's 1 month. But you see, that slight change didn't really make much difference. And the Maoris are really overwhelmed by this immigration. Nearly 50% of the population are immigrants. And among these 50%, a large majority are actually illegal immigrants, which makes things extremely difficult for the Maoris themselves, which would explain a little bit why more and more young Maoris actually leave Mayotte and go to La Réunion.
Dr. Mrgudovic, I do want to continue, expand upon that point on immigration. But before we get there, I did really want to also zoom in on some of the latest developments we've seen in Mayotte. That's because over the past 24 hours, Emmanuel Macron's discourse has probably arguably inflamed tensions. And of course, beyond this question of immigration, the president saying that if the island were not French, it would have been in an even worse off situation. He ostensibly yelling at people for even complaining about the hardship. His words were really quite crude. I'm sure this is likely to be received as almost colonial era discourse.
Well, you could say that, yes, indeed, or a discourse of someone who is completely out of touch with reality, in Mayotte at least.
Unlike its neighbors, nonetheless, Mayotte, of course, voted to remain a part of France in the 70s before later becoming a full overseas department in 2011. Do you think that this growing frustration, this growing sense, like you say, of a president that is totally out of touch with the reality for people on the ground could ultimately lead to its break from France, at least in the medium to long term?
No, definitely not, because the Comoros Islands, which initially, that was a French colony with 4 islands. And in 1974, the referendum in Comores in 1946, it became an overseas territory with the right to self-determination. And in 1974, they asked for this right to self-determination to be implemented. And 3 out of the 4 islands voted for independence. And Mayotte remained French, wanted to remain French, and did remain French. And the Comoros Islands, since then, have always claimed that this was undue and that Mayotte should have stayed in the Comoros. Mayotte doesn't want to be part of the Comoros anymore. And therefore, they know that, first of all, they don't want to become independent. They wouldn't sustain. Financially, it would be a disaster, even worse than now. So Macron is not completely wrong when he says that, but he shouldn't have said it that way. And the fear, so there would be a double fear for Maoris if they were to become independent, that financially they wouldn't be able to sustain viability. And second, the Comoros Island would come and grab them immediately, which would make things even worse.
We have just a little bit of time left, Dr. Mrgudovic, so I want to finish with a final question, because you are an expert in the relationship between France and its territories in the South Pacific. Specifically, that's, of course, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna. These territories are, of course, equally vulnerable to extreme weather events like the ones that we have seen in Mayotte. Do you think that what we're seeing is a preview to what could happen in the South Pacific? I mean, from a political perspective, do people in these territories feel abandoned as well?
Well, in New Caledonia, it was not a cyclone. It was a rebellion, a riot of the population in May. Since May, actually, in New Caledonia. It's calming down now. And they have destroyed a lot of buildings and supermarkets, etc., schools, etc. So that was not a cyclone, that was a social riot, political riot in New Caledonia. And they do feel, half of them could feel a little bit abandoned. They want more help from France. And the other half of New Caledonia, they want to be even more abandoned by France. They want their independence. And they wouldn't mind to have to face any natural disaster that could occur, because obviously the international organizations and the EU would be there also to provide help, including the neighbors, or obviously Australia, New Zealand, etc.
Dr. Nathalie Mrgudovic, senior lecturer at Aston University in the United Kingdom, thank you so much for joining us today. That's unfortunately all we have time for.
My pleasure.